Welcome to the History Guy podcast, Counterfactuals. What is a counterfactual? In the context of studying history, it is a kind of analysis where we examine what might have happened had historical events gone differently. As a thought experiment, the goal is to learn and understand history as it is by talking about what it could have been. As a twist on the historical stories that we tell on the History Guy YouTube channel, this is a series of podcasts that dwell on that eternal question: what if? I'm Josh, a writer for the YouTube channel and son of the History Guy. If you're a fan of the channel, you already know Lance, the History Guy himself. To liven up our discussions on what might have happened, we have invited Brad Wagnon, history aficionado and a longtime friend of the History Guy, to join us. Remember that if you'd like to support us, you can find us on Patreon, YouTube, and locals.com. Join us as we discuss what deserves to be remembered and what might have been. On today's episode, we discuss the impacts of the largest volcanic eruption in recorded human history, the 1815 eruption of Mount Tambora, which would impact the entire world and bring on a volcanic winter, the so-called year without a summer. Without further ado, let me introduce the History Guy.
I had a dream, which was not all a dream. The bright sun was extinguished, and the stars did wander darkling in the eternal space. Rayless and pathless, the icy earth swung blind and blackening in the moonless air. The opening lines to the poem Darkness by Lord Byron, where the protagonist predicts the end of the earth, paint a dismal picture. Some say that Byron was inspired by an Italian scientist's prediction that the sun was about to burn out and that the earth was going to be doomed. Others say that it was an analogy for his failing marriage. But the poem unquestionably was inspired by real events of the day. In 1815, Mount Tambora, in what was then the Dutch East Indies, erupted. It was the largest volcanic eruption in human history, although there's some evidence that there were larger eruptions in prehistory. The impact on the people in the immediate area was, of course, devastating, but the long-term impacts on the entire Earth were vast and surprising. The impact of the 1815 eruption of Mount Tambora deserves to be remembered. After centuries of dormancy, the approximately 14,100-foot-tall Mount Tambora on the island of Sumbawa started to rumble in 1812. On April 5th, 1815, the volcano started a massive eruption, continuing until a violent climax on April 10th, with explosions so loud they were heard at least 1,600 miles away in Sumatra. The explosions were heard so clearly in Java, 780 miles distant, that the British Army thought that it was cannon fire and dispatched troops, thinking that a nearby army post was under attack. The relative explosiveness of a volcanic eruption is measured by the Volcanic Explosivity Index, or VEI. Devised in 1982 by scientists working with the U.S. Geological Survey and the University of Hawaii. The primary eruption characteristic used to determine the Volcanic Explosivity Index is the volume of pyroclastic material, essentially fragments of rock, ejected by the volcano, and thus the VEI of historic volcanoes can be estimated from their craters. The scale is logarithmic, with each interval on the scale representing a tenfold increase in observed ejecta criteria. Thus, the 1991 eruption of Mount Pinatubo at VEI magnitude 6 ejected about 10 times as much pyroclastic material as the VEI magnitude 5 eruption of Mount St. Helens in 1980. While the scale is theoretically open-ended, the most explosive volcanic eruptions in history, called supervolcanoes, have had a VEI magnitude of 8. The last magnitude 8 eruption in history was in New Zealand, around 25,360 BC. The Tambora eruption of 1815 had a VEI magnitude of 7, releasing 10 times the amount of pyroclastic material as Pinatubo. It was the most powerful volcanic eruption in human history. The amount of material ejected was mind-blowingly massive. Nearly 10 cubic miles of stone, some 10 billion tons worth, was ejected as ash. The mountain lost nearly 5,000 feet of elevation, with ash falling more than 800 miles away. Explosions continued into mid-July, and smoke was still being emitted in August. Aftershocks continued for years. The effect on the surrounding area was, of course, devastating. The vegetation on the island was entirely destroyed, and some estimates put the immediate deaths due to the eruption in excess of 10,000. But those numbers only represent those killed immediately by the ash and gas from the explosion. The eruption also caused a moderate tsunami that was estimated to have killed about 4,500 people. But the effects of the eruption, of course, reach farther than the immediate blast. The ash kills crops, so people die of starvation. The ash destroys homes, so that people are exposed to weather and unsanitary conditions. The unsanitary conditions are breeding grounds for pathogens like cholera bacteria, and the people exposed to those pathogens are more susceptible to them because their bodies are weakened by the starvation and exposure. Volcanoes also release gases like sulfur that can damage lungs and make people more susceptible to respiratory infections like colds and influenza. The after effects of the eruption are generally thought to have resulted in many times those deaths caused directly by the eruption. But the 1815 Tambora eruption is known for more than its immediate effects. Rather, it is a study in how natural disasters affect world events in sometimes very surprising ways. The general discussion of the worldwide effects of the Tambora eruption largely tend to focus on the effect that the particles in the atmosphere had on the weather in the summer of 1816, and we'll get there in a moment. But more recent scientific research suggests that large eruptions like Tambora can have a more immediate atmospheric effect, and in 1815, that might have dramatically impacted one of the most important events in European history. Volcanic eruptions throw material and gases into the atmosphere, and that can cause large effects on climate, and certainly did in the case of Tambora. But it takes time for those particles to move around the planet. New research published in 2018 by Dr. Matthew Gensch of Imperial College London suggests the effects of an eruption can actually impact the climate much faster. The impact of volcanic particles was long thought to have an atmospheric limit. That is, Gensch explains, it has long been conventional wisdom that volcanic tephra, the small particles of rock, could not be injected into higher layers of Earth's atmosphere because temperature inversion in the stratosphere acts as a barrier to convective rise. But Gensch notes that large volcanic eruptions include a significant electrostatic charge, and that allows tiny charged particles to rise much higher than previously expected through a process called electrostatic levitation. They go all the way up into the ionosphere, much higher than the stratosphere. The ionosphere is heavily ionized by solar radiation, but the charged particles carry a negative charge, which reduces the positive ion density in the atmosphere. The ionosphere will then seek equilibrium, changes that are both global and effectively immediate. Gensch concludes that large explosive eruptions could, therefore, have a significant effect on the global electrical circuit. The change then affects the formation of clouds by disrupting the formation of cloud nuclei, with the immediate effect of decreasing rainfall globally. However, that then means that more moisture is trapped in the atmosphere, and as the ionosphere recovers, there can be a rebound period of significantly more rain. Such impacts might occur months before things like sulfate aerosols from the eruption that affect climate via different means might spread to impact a particular part of the globe. Gensch notes that there is data to indicate that electrostatic levitation occurred after the eruption of Krakatoa volcano in 1883. This effect, even if it's short-lived, can have a large impact. Agriculture often depends upon rain at the right time, and having too little rain or too much rain at the wrong time can significantly affect crop yields. But rain affects things outside agriculture. For example, a 2006 paper published by the Royal Meteorological Society notes that there's evidence that the months of May and June 1815 were particularly wet in Europe, effects consistent with Gensch's conclusions regarding the effect of electrostatic levitation following the April eruption of Tambora. That rain included a particularly violent storm of the continent the night of June 17th, which left sodden ground in the United Kingdom of the Netherlands the morning of June 18th. That was a problem for one Napoleon Bonaparte, who on June 18th was rushing to engage the Allied Anglo-Dutch army under the Duke of Wellington before they could join with Gebhard von Blücher's Prussian army. Napoleon's great advantage was his greater number of heavy artillery pieces. The sodden ground delayed his pursuit, meaning that the battle fought on ground chosen by Wellington was fought some hours later than it likely would have been had the ground been more amenable to moving heavy cannon. Despite the battle's name, it was not actually fought in the village of Waterloo, where Wellington had located his headquarters some 3 miles distant from the battlefield. But it was true that Bonaparte met his metaphorical Waterloo, as he failed to defeat Wellington's army before Blücher's army arrived on his flank. As a result, Napoleon's army was routed, Napoleon was finally defeated, and the Napoleonic Wars came to an end. While being careful not to suggest that weather positively determines the outcomes of a battle, the overall suggestion is that the eruption in the Dutch East Indies in April might have impacted the result of the Battle of Waterloo. Victor Hugo, who was present at the battle, certainly thought so. Writing in his 1862 work Les Miserables, he said, "Had it not rained on the night of 17-18 June, 1815, the future of Europe would have been different." While the battle hinged on many factors, it's hard to discount the possibility that the weather may have swung the difference. For as the Duke of Wellington later said, the Battle of Waterloo was the nearest run thing you ever saw in your life. Historians can argue forever over the counterfactual of what might have happened had Napoleon won at Waterloo, but the impact may have been rather large. Writing in Smithsonian Magazine on the 200th anniversary of the battle in 2015, British historian Andrew Roberts contends, if Napoleon had remained Emperor of France for the 6 years remaining in his natural life, European civilization would have benefited inestimably. The reactionary Holy Alliance of Russia, Prussia, and Austria would not have been able to crush liberal constitutionalist movements in Spain, Greece, Eastern Europe, and elsewhere. Pressure to join France in abolishing slavery in Asia, Africa, and the Caribbean would have grown. The benefits of meritocracy over feudalism would have had time to become more widely appreciated. Jews would not have been forced back into their ghettos in the Papal States and made to wear the yellow star again. Encouragement of the arts and sciences would have been better understood and copied, and the plans to rebuild Paris would have been implemented, making it the most gorgeous city in the world. All lost because of a volcanic eruption some 7,600 miles away. And Tambora's effects had just begun. The volcano had thrown up billions of tons of ash and sulfur gases. The ash had an ablative effect, blocking the sun as it moves through the atmosphere, but the greatest effect comes from the sulfur gases, SO2, in the stratosphere. The sulfur then oxidizes to form sulfate aerosols, and the aerosols reflect the solar radiation, cooling the surface, but also warm the stratosphere as they collect solar radiation. The mix changes circulation in the atmosphere, causing extreme climate fluctuations. Tambora was a massive eruption. One scientific paper studying the effect of the eruption concluded, the eruption of Mount Tambora is therefore very likely to have had a profound impact on a global scale. The result, when combined with other atmospheric effects of the time, was something called volcanic winter. But the people in 1816 called it the year without a summer. Global average temperatures were some 1.7 degrees Fahrenheit or 0.7 degrees Celsius colder than normal. It was the coldest year in Europe in 250 years. The cold temperatures and late freezes caused widespread crop failures throughout Europe and North America. Disrupted weather patterns caused flooding in Northern Europe, China, and India. The price of food crops skyrocketed in what historian John D. Post called the last great subsistence crisis in the Western world. Still reeling from the devastation of the Napoleonic Wars, food riots occurred all over Europe. In the United States, New England faced hard freezes throughout the summer. Transportation networks were disrupted as lakes and rivers usually used for commerce froze over. The price of oats in the U.S. increased nearly sevenfold. The food shortages and unusual wetness contributed to the spread of disease, cholera in India, typhus in Ireland. One BBC documentary estimated that death rates were essentially doubled in Europe in 1816, a number that would mean some 200,000 extra deaths. The disruptions caused large-scale migration. In the U.S., many agricultural families moved west, contributing to westward expansion and growing populations that would lead to the creation of the states of Indiana and Illinois. The westward expansion raised tensions, both with Native American populations and in the regional tensions that would eventually erupt into the U.S. Civil War. Migrations from New England to western and central New York turned the area into a central location of abolitionist sentiment. One estimate had Vermont losing population between 10 and 15,000, dramatically reducing population growth in the state. Vermonter Joseph Smith was one of those who migrated to New York due to the effects of the year without a summer. It was in New York that he claimed to discover the tablets that were translated into what would become the Book of Mormon, leading to the foundation of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, a religion that today has nearly 15 million adherents and has played various significant roles in U.S. history. The tephra in the atmosphere gave the sky a yellow tinge and at times so obstructed the view of the sun that sunspots could be seen with the naked eye. This was seen by some as a sign that the world was about to end, causing panic. But the same effect resulted in brilliant sunsets captured in the works of British artist J.M.W. Turner. Some of the unexpected effects were startling. The rise of the price of oats in Germany made horse ownership, the primary mode of personal transportation, much more expensive. A 2005 edition of New Scientist magazine suggested that the cost of oats prompted German inventor Karl Dreis to invent the Loss machine, a human-powered alternative to the horse. The machine, commonly called the dandy horse, patented in 1817, was the precursor to the bicycle. Near Geneva, Switzerland, a group of poets and writers renting a villa were essentially forced to live indoors in that dismal summer. In their confinement, one of the poets suggested a ghost contest to see who could commemorate the dreary existence by writing the scariest story. The person making that suggestion was George Gordon Byron, better known as Lord Byron, and one of his products was the poem Darkness. His unfinished work called A Fragment was one of the first in English to feature a vampire theme, and is credited by some as the genesis of vampire horror literature. Another member of the group created the idea for her great novel, set in the dismal weather of the year without a summer. Published anonymously in 1818, the work Frankenstein, the Modern Prometheus by Mary Shelley is considered one of the most influential novels of all time. The eruption of Mount Tambora was not the only factor in the unique climate of the year 1816. There were other volcanic eruptions that also might have affected it, and it was a time of a solar nadir. But more recent research suggests that the eruption of Tambora was the primary, most important factor causing that weather in 1816. And we've observed in much smaller form the same impacts coming from volcanic eruptions that have occurred since, supporting that idea that it was the eruption of Tambora that was the primary reason that 1816 was the year without a summer. And that eruption in 1815 represents the integral connection between human history and natural events. Mount Tambora is still an active volcano. It's being constantly monitored. It has a growing lava dome. Modern estimates say that because of the growth in population in Indonesia, if Tambora were to erupt today with the same ferocity that it did in 1815, some 8 million people would be in the area that was immediately affected.
Now for the fun part, where I, the history guy himself, and longtime friend of the history guy Brad Wagnon, discuss what could have happened if Mount Tambora hadn't erupted. Of the many, many things we've talked about on the channel and on the podcast, one of the things that is so interesting about Mount Tambora specifically is that many of the single events that we talk about as turning points or something like that have a lot of human kind of options and choices and stuff that have gone into building up before them. And the thing with Mount Tambora is that there was nothing humans could have done to speed it up, to slow it down. It was 100% an act of nature. And
but it's fair to say there were some other eruptions and stuff that affected it. But I mean, the things that these events were things that were outside of human control. It was not politics. It was not war. It was not opinion. It was mountains erupting.
Yeah, and absolutely, I mean, and just an incredible, we have nothing in recorded human history quite like this one. And we could, I mean, there's no reason to say we couldn't face something like this again.
Yeah, I mean, well, it's from a number of different sources, of course, but from Tambora. I mean, Tambora is already Krakatoa too, I mean, which had a huge impact too. And then those have both grown into large lava domes. And so, who knows what's going to happen. And if we had a year without a summer now, would we survive it? What would it mean for the food supply and stuff like that? Is an interesting question.
It is.
Yeah. To the point of it hasn't happened before in history, there is at least one incident in 535 AD. Apparently there was a major volcanic eruption, and in doing some of the research for this Tambora episode, it looks as if they think that it was another Krakatoa. However, obviously there were not European and there wasn't a European presence in the area at that point, and there doesn't appear to be a lot of contemporary information coming out of other empires of the day.
There's also a BC event when there was population in Oceania, but I mean none of it seems to be tracked. But it's like when they had the tsunami in Indonesia, or it washed over Andaman Island, and so they were worried about the population, the Andamanese population. Of course, there's no contact population. You go there, they kill you. And they found out they were all fine. I mean, they saw the ocean go out, and they went up to the high ground. And so this has happened enough that people have this, built into their tribal memory, some sort of dance that they teach them when they're young, so they know when to run. And so this stuff probably happened before. But I mean, there's nothing quite really in recorded history that was as dramatic as the impact of the year without a summer, which might have been the massive eruption of Tambora, or it might have been the fact that there might have been within a 2-year period there for 5 large volcanic eruptions.
Yeah, 536 was. I was thinking that when Brad mentioned that it caused. So that 535 is when the eruption was, I think, but it did cause like a protracted episode of cooling. But Mount Tambora, when we see something of this size that is creating problems, I mean, all around the world, it's really interesting to see that and see that because we didn't understand those issues in 1815. They had no idea when they had the year without a summer. They did not necessarily know all of the complicated ways in which a volcanic eruption halfway around the world might impact them.
I mean, the first thing mentioned really in the episode, which is Waterloo, which is a good point to discuss. I mean, that's still just a theory that the eruption was so large that it disrupted the ionosphere so significantly that there wasn't rain, and then all the rain was let go. And so, I mean, there's certainly no way that they at the time would have been connecting that to Tambora, and actually, connecting the rest of it to Tambora, because you're a year later before you get the year without summer. So, yeah, this stuff, at least if a volcano is going off now, we would see it. We would have an idea.
We would learn a lot of science if we saw something like that. I mean, it would also be absolutely terrible because
that would have made it like air travel by jet engine would have been impossible for months and months afterwards for vast swaths of the Pacific or of the Indian Ocean area, and some of that stuff today. But also we noted in this, but we also noted in this when we've talked about other volcanic eruptions and things too, is that the way populations have changed, the death toll will be much, much larger today, simply because there's much, much more population in the area. So I mean, if it's, there is the counterfactual, which I think we're really here to talk about, to say what if we hadn't had the year without a summer. But there's always that question to say, given the significance of this impact, what would it mean today? And a lot. It would mean a lot. It would be huge. And the disruption would be in the immediate vicinity would be just devastating. I mean, outside of there too. And there's other things stressing the food supply. The war in Ukraine is stressing the food supply, and there's other things stressing the world food supply that if you exacerbate that, then we might actually get to a point where there's another food crisis, which there hasn't been a food crisis in the Western world since the year without a summer.
Yes, and the things that have also changed, let's face it, we live in a society in which we are hyper-specialized. A very large portion of our population doesn't even know that plants grow from the ground. They may have seen something like this in their public schools, but have they ever been to an operational farm? Do they have a real good understanding of just what it is to go out and...
We don't have a culture built where you generally have gardens in the back that you could use to soften a food crisis, which we would have had in 1812 or 1815 or 1912 or 1915. And society's fragile. I mean, if it disrupted satellite communication, et cetera, there's a lot of stuff we have that wouldn't be able to operate. I mean,
I'm pretty sure that without World of Warcraft, an entire generation would.
Well, they have in the movie Gravity. There's just this throwaway line where he says half of North America just lost Facebook, and they act like, oh, so what?
Yeah.
They're like, we're more worried about Facebook than we are about one astronaut. But I mean, just think how big it would be if you had that sort of thing where, I don't know, was it a satellite exploded or something that started knocking satellites out? How much we have that depends upon satellite communication and GPS.
I mean, that one company
that was CrowdStrike, right? That was built into
And so all of the problems that were caused from that. I mean, we're talking so much of our things that people don't expect rely on being connected to the internet or to some specific application or group or something like that. I mean, I think a shocking number of things would go down. We would learn
how. I mean, civilization is fragile. Yeah. And look at the number of people who say know what a car is. How many people could make one? And so if you had some, event that killed lots and lots of people, what are the odds that we're going to come out with people that have all the skills to fix what we're going to do?
Even to fix one that if you've already got one built, there's a lot of problems that could go on with my car that I would have no clue how to fix.
Yeah, we don't have to, how quickly would.
And if I don't have YouTube to go look up, I mean, that's a whole different. I don't have that
So
experience.
I didn't expect that we'd wander into post-apocalypse here.
That's
the
true.
Real question, the most important question is, could a volcanic eruption cause a zombie apocalypse?
And I gotta say, it sure seems like it's possible.
It sure seems if someone's going to make zombies, why not? Yeah,
No. Clearly, it would be vampires because the sun would be blocked.
So
the vampires could emerge.
Fiction show where there was a nuclear winter, and it turned out.
I believe that it was the new Twilight Zone.
Well, it probably was. Yeah, and then the vampires all came out, and the guy was locked in the missile silo or something like that. So. Now, what if there was a zombie and a vampire apocalypse? Would they oppose each other? Would the vampires control the zombies?
Does a zombie...
Could a vampire feed on a zombie?
Yeah.
Can a zombie feed on a vampire?
Vampires still have brains, and zombies often still have blood.
Oh, that's true. And we sick them on each other. Now, there's a story in there, yeah. Humanity is a sideline in the zombies versus vampires.
Well... Yeah.
That's not where I expected conversation to go, but
yeah, according to my D&D lore, the vampires, being a higher rank undead, would clearly control the zombies.
Oh, that's true. That's true. That's on it. Do we have any clerics that we can trust long enough to try to turn that? I just don't know.
That's a lot of
suddenly it will be important.
We'll need people to turn to clerics as a class very quickly.
How many times can you do that per day again? I don't know.
And speaking of vampires, of course, one of the many things that might have been different if Mount Tambora had not erupted, or at least erupted at the time that it did, is kind of modern vampire fiction, which...
Oh, absolutely, yeah. We might never have gotten it, yeah. Because it was Byron told a story. So they had the contest.
Yeah.
Byron told a story. It was eventually written down by Pollinari, right? By the doctor that was there. And so no vampire fiction. No Frankenstein, too. Gothic horror completely stolen from popular culture.
What I do think I can take from this is that I can blame Mount Tambora for Twilight. That's what I think
goodness.
I can take.
Oh,
from
clearly.
If not for Mount Tambora, we would not have Twilight. Now, we would have lost...
Therefore...
Well, that might be worth it. I don't know. Yeah.
Therefore, Tambora is in fact God's retribution upon modern entertainment.
Yes.
Well, I think we're going to see that most of the effects of Tambora were bad, and maybe that's one of the worst. Is that now, actually, because it's not the story of Vlad the Impaler, well predates that. But the idea, everything that we see is the modern version. Well, maybe not the sparkling ones, but I mean the version of vampire that comes together into sort of the thematic Dracula story that has been the work of so much fiction. That really did come from that one story idea from Byron that he told to Pollinari, who carried it out. So that's a very good point. And of course, Frankenstein too. Yeah. And those, do Shelley and Byron and Mary Shelley, do they become that close if it's not for The Year Without a Summer? Or what if they just stayed in the house that summer? It was a beautiful summer. Do we not get Gothic horror? That's a really interesting question.
You have less reason to stay inside and write ghost stories, and it's incredible because joking aside, this was a monumental part of literature. I mean, they talk about Frankenstein as being kind of this proto-science fiction stuff. And there's a lot. I mean, we still tell a lot of Frankenstein stories that are either, directly inspired by or are just using kind of parts of Frankenstein. And I think that's a huge effect, not just on, popular culture, but on literature since 1815, essentially.
Yeah, and would the literature be completely different? Would there be a horror genre, and would we be as a society maybe a brighter society?
We don't have
turn less to horror.
The dark and the gothic.
There's no goths if we don't have The Year Without a Summer, and there's no goths. That's what we lose. Black eyeliner goes out of business.
No My Chemical Romance.
No one buys black lipstick anymore.
I was interested to see, doing the research on this, that apparently Schubert, during The Year Without a Summer, he received only a single commission. And he, however, continued to put out a lot of works. In fact, apparently 2 symphonies as well as multiple other works. And the theory is there are a lot of musical historians who think that he suffered from SAD.
Oh, interesting.
So...
and if you really had seasonal affective disorder, that's got to be a rough year for you. 1916 would be.
Yeah, exactly. And all of the follow-on, a lot of the surrealism and a lot of the changes in art that at least can somewhat be attributed to the fact that the sunsets are radically different. The sky looks radically different because of the amount of sulfur that's in the atmosphere that's creating the aerosols.
That's right. And there's some famous art that comes from the period because of that. So, I mean, and how different would society be without, those pretty sunsets being painted?
Yeah, and that's a hard question because so much of history is based on the history of politics and warfare. There isn't a whole lot of, I guess you'd say maybe it's not as popular, and it's much harder, I think, to draw inferences. But
it is.
What happens if there's not a Leonardo da Vinci?
It talks about the history of art, but it doesn't really focus on how art is impacting culture over time. So, I mean, what if our literature is completely different? What if our painting is completely different? What if our music is completely? What if we lost these pieces at this time? How different would society be? That's not a common field of study.
No. It's one of the, I guess that if you look at history at any point in time, you have to say, where is the lost history that we just aren't able to draw some of the answers that we want to. And that's an interesting large question mark in history to me is, without the Gothic horror, what genre takes its place? What if, what if we got an early version of romance novels instead of the Gothic horror? And what effect might that have had? And I think that's really hard to draw a conclusion on that.
It is. I mean, just to see how society would be different if you change that bit of history. And those are some of the bicycle too. Right?
Oh, yeah.
Would we eventually have invented the bicycle? Because theoretically, the bicycle was invented because oats became so expensive because of the year without a summer that people couldn't afford to keep horses. So, I mean, do we keep horses for a much longer period of time? When is the bicycle invented? Or is it invented?
Yeah.
And how different is it if we never invented the thing? If we never even thought of that idea because we could afford oats?
It's an interesting question. What if
my morning drive would be a lot easier if I didn't have to compete with all of the bicycle lanes here in my mighty city.
But how would it be if you had to compete with horse lanes? That's
true.
There you go.
But
Now,
I don't know if
there's a question.
Delayed the invention of the internal combustion engine, but it might mean so horses I think are still going to get replaced by internal combustion. But I mean it's at some point. I mean bicycles are important.
Yeah.
And it impact us in various ways. And so what if we hadn't, what if bicycles hadn't been invented or the precursor of the bicycle hadn't been invented in 1816 because of the price of oats? Then do we have bicycles today? Are they different? Does it change the world?
Because that also gave people, the opportunity to popularize the bicycle. So even if it was invented even at a similar time, I mean, people don't pick it up. And maybe then it just becomes one of those ideas that no one really thought would work and didn't work, and then before you know it, the whole bicycle culture has changed. And it's hard to know. I'm not I don't know too much about exactly how all of our bicycle how advancements happened. I did write an episode on motorcycles where I talked a little bit about bicycle history, but it's interesting to talk about how that might have shifted.
Certainly enveloped, but the Wright brothers were bicycle repairmen, and that's where they got their mechanical skill. So I mean, it's kind of hard. I mean, you're making a big stretch here. So that if Tambora hadn't erupted, then we wouldn't have invented the bicycle.
Yeah.
But I mean, you could at least stretch to say if Tambora hadn't erupted, maybe the bicycle gets adopted later, and maybe some of those improvements in the bicycle come much later. And what all things might that have impacted? And it might have impacted automobiles because a lot of the people that worked on automobiles were originally people who were working on bicycles, and a lot of the mechanical skill came from the bicycle. It's not just losing whatever the 30 bicycle events at the Olympics, but it is we use a lot of bicycles in culture. So in different ways, and at points they were used in warfare, and a lot of people still ride their bike today. What if we don't have that? It's an interesting question. And that's one of those many, really, strange impacts of the eruption of Tambora.
Yeah, something that you would not expect at all.
Yeah, and let's face it, from probably from the 1940s into the 1950s on, easily until the beginning of this millennium, the bicycle is a rite of passage for many children.
You're right. Yeah. Well, I mean, how different would our childhoods be without Frankenstein, Dracula, and bicycles? I mean,
there you go.
It'd be a lot, right?
Yeah.
You're right. I mean, our day, you just got on your bike and you came back when the street lights came on, right? And your bicycle was freedom. And that would be different if they hadn't invented the dandy horse. Of course, I mean, would we have horses because of the price of boats? Maybe we just go out in the morning and ride around. We all have a horse.
If oat prices remained low enough, but it seems like eventually there would have been, horse. You're right. The horses would have been replaced. I mean, these days, gosh, it's a lot more expensive to maintain a horse than it used to be, and I feel like that's not just the price of oats.
Yeah, but I mean, and its bicycles didn't just is the only thing that replaced horses, but I mean, wouldn't just delaying bicycles would have impacted how long we stuck with horses in various ways. Yeah. So if we hadn't had bicycles as kids, I mean, what else would we have used? I don't know.
Because maybe childhood.
Maybe we'd have thought up, vampire stories in Frankenstein.
No, another thing about bicycles is that they do contribute to urban living.
Yeah, sure.
Because obviously streets choked with horses.
It's true. Would cities be smaller? If it went for the year without a summer, would cities be smaller? Because we never invented the bicycle, which was a certain part of the urbanization of society.
Gosh, you see places in those like mega urban regions in Asia where there are just so many bicycles. That's gotten to the point where the traffic is just so insane that you'd rather ride a bicycle for, even distances that I think a lot of people would think are a little crazy.
Right. A lot of suburban living or urban living would be impossible without bicycles, and so do we invent them anyway? I mean, the idea seems pretty obvious in some ways, or do we not? I mean, because it was invented to replace the horse. So I don't know.
It's kind of interesting that it took as that long to think exactly, because we had wheels well before that. But for us to talk about a bicycle, I mean, the fact that it might have taken horses becoming more expensive to maintain for us to pick up the bicycle.
So we saw the need and came up with the reason for a bicycle.
Because maybe that's just because it was easier when you had horses, when you didn't have any reason to stop using the horse. So even if we just don't have that reason in the rise of the cost of oats, then people just keep pushing that off. Not necessarily because it isn't an obvious and fairly simple solution, but just because you're kind of doing whatever's the easiest way, and that's just to keep riding your horse.
It was invented for men who needed to have travel, who couldn't afford a horse, and maybe that's what it took to make it. It started as a luxury item before it could become a kid's item.
True.
And so maybe the idea doesn't come around. Or it doesn't come around for a very long time.
And I do have to throw out a shout out to our friends in Europe. The bicycle is certainly far more pervasive, especially in urban areas, than it is in the United States. And, all of the differences you have in urban density, as well as, various regulations and just, the general expense of owning a car.
It is, yeah. There's lots of places in the United States, too. There's a lot of bicycles. But you're right. In major European cities, it's crazy. We were in Munich and on a bicycle tour. I was just trying not to ride into traffic. And this girl goes by, and she's like riding a bicycle and eating soup while riding a bicycle. So yeah, you're right. Europeans are much more bicycle-oriented.
Wow.
And what would be maybe Europeans would be different if it hadn't been for the year without a summer. Of course, one of the things that you really have to kind of get a grip on. The year without a summer, the thing caused 200,000 extra deaths in Europe. Caused at least tens of thousands of deaths from the eruption of Tambora. And deaths across the world because of the food shortage and stuff like that. I mean, some of those people might have done something.
Yeah, I think we can't know what, but
we can't know what, we don't know, but some of those people might have done something that changed everything, or maybe the overpopulation would lead to wars sooner. Or you can't ignore just the sheer number of people that died as a result of this event and say how different it would be if they had not starved to death in 1816. Or died of cold.
Well, speaking of people who died from something caused by Mount Tambora, one of the things I was reading when I was looking into this was, of course, there's a cholera pandemic that goes, I mean, it crosses most of Asia and into the Middle East. And one of the things that Mount Tambora might have done is because cholera existed before that, but they're actually talking that because of the unseasonable flooding and how essentially how all of the changes that came from Mount Tambora might have actually altered the ecology enough to have a more virulent strain of cholera. Wow. And so it's not just saying that people were more essentially weaker to it because of floods and hunger and stuff like that.
Yeah, disease tends to follow displacement following a disaster like that.
Yeah, but that the actual strain of cholera that affected us in 1817 and what they call the first cholera pandemic might actually have been indirectly or even more directly caused by Mount Tambora's eruption.
The environmental changes that came from Tambora. Wow, because cholera comes back many times. Yeah, more soldiers died of cholera in the Crimean War than died of war injuries.
Something like 1 to 2 million people died in this cholera epidemic, including, and one of the reasons it became kind of a bigger deal than the cholera that had existed there in the past. It killed thousands of British soldiers in India, which means that Europe was made very much aware of this disease that had not been to Europe before, and it's incredible to think about that.
Wow.
Yeah, it also is a reflection of where we were in human history at that point, where there was far more traffic, far more trade, and a lot of exchanges that were going on that would simply not have occurred 500 years earlier.
Well, it's one I certainly hadn't thought of, but if Tambora caused a more virulent strain of cholera, then that's a huge worldwide impact. That might impact the world for many decades after. Cholera still kills a lot of people, but it certainly had massive cholera outbreaks throughout history that killed people across the world.
Yeah, and if you might, that would mean that you might be able to continue to essentially connect changes caused by Tambora. To centuries away. Because of this, because of cholera, and I'm not exactly sure what the science looks like on that. Someone who is a virologist or something might be able to totally, well, it's a bacteria, I guess, but might be able to totally debunk that. But from what I was looking into, there were multiple sources that talked about how the ecology altering might have actually kind of changed how virulent
if there's a
cholera
biologist
was.
Wants to talk about that in the comments, I'd love to hear it because it's an interesting question. It's one I hadn't looked at. But again, too, just the number of people that were killed by that at the time, and who knows who that was or what that would have been, what they might have accomplished, or what having that amount of population. We invented a lot of mechanical stuff because of the Black Deaths. If we'd kept that population, what might not have been invented, or what wars might have started, or what might have gone on down the road because of that amount of population.
And that becomes extremely difficult, of course, for us to actually predict. But
it is. We can get to narrower things. The Great Awakening in America, very much impacted by the Year Without a Summer. And that Great Awakening had a lot to do with early 19th century America and the direction that America went. If we weren't as religious a nation, if we hadn't started as religious a nation or had the Great Awakening, we started as a religious nation, but that changed in the 19th century. Maybe we don't expand as quickly to the West. Maybe we don't move to abolition as quickly. It could dramatically impact. What if the North doesn't become so virulently abolitionist because we don't have the Great Awakening? Is the whole nation remain a slave nation, or does it reduce the tension so that we in slavery without having to fight a civil war? That's a very powerful impact, and without two crop failures, right? Then Joseph Smith doesn't wander into the Great Awakening, and we never get a Mormon church. And so maybe Utah still might be a desert, right?
Yeah, I am absolutely fascinated by a couple of effects also that did not necessarily focus on the United States and Europe. For instance, the Yunnan province in China, the climate change caused a famine. Something that I discovered in doing some of the research for this was that China has insisted for quite some time before this time period that taxes be paid in silver. So the province of Yunnan, because they lost their rice, they went to growing poppies. And less than 30, 40 years later, that turned into a huge problem that was exacerbated, and we now call them the Opium Wars.
Mm-hmm. Wow.
And
how would the different would the world be without opiates, for heaven's sakes?
Yeah.
How many lives have been lost to that? Yeah.
One of the few examples that I found where the Year Without a Summer did not have an impact, or at least not in the way that you would expect, was apparently Korea in 1815 had a huge famine. However, 1816 and 1817, due to whatever way the winds were blowing and the weather was developing, they actually had a bumper crop in 1816 and at least normal in 1817.
So that might have been Mount Tambora benefiting the Koreans in that way.
Yeah,
which is one of the big ones that we didn't bring up. It was the first thing we thought we'd bring up, right? If you don't get rain on that morning, then Napoleon moves his heavy artillery in 2 hours earlier. Does he break the British before the Prussians arrive?
Yeah.
And what happens if Napoleon wins the Battle of Waterloo?
It does feel like the one we have to talk about. And it's interesting, when you talk about it in the episode, it's not like the concept that weather, had an impact is unique to the modern era. I mean, it seems like even at the time, or, fairly shortly afterward, I mean, the people were talking about how that weather might have kind of decided Absolutely. That day.
Wellington said it was the closest run thing you'd ever see, and so the heavy artillery was where Napoleon's advantage is.
Yeah.
It is, if it had not been so rainy that morning, it is very possible. I mean, it's not just that weather determines battles, but I mean it's very possible that Napoleon wins the Battle of Waterloo, forces the British Army to break.
As it was not that, as Wellington said, it was close. And it was all about him holding on until the Prussians came. And if he had a couple more hours
to bombard with his heavy artillery,
and if he beats the English and the Prussians right then, he's probably got some space before the Russians and the Austrians can put together their forces to deal with him. And that's what he needed. He just didn't have enough time.
What he's really looking at the time is that he's looking to negotiate from a position of strength so that he stays in power because he's come back from Elba. And so it could be that if the British lose Waterloo, it could be a period of stability in Europe. It could be a period of peace when Napoleon's win there keeps a large amount of Europe under Napoleon's thumb. The Napoleonic Wars end with him in power, and that could that might have been a great thing for Europe in many ways. Whatever you want to say about Napoleon, in many ways he was very much more modern than the people that he was fighting. So. For example, then that reduces the power of the Conservatives in the UK. So maybe we never get a Wellington, the Iron Duke there. Maybe he's never prime minister. But if the Whigs are empowered at that time versus the Conservatives, that might mean that the UK bans slavery 30 years earlier. It might be that slavery is banned across Europe, which would have a large impact in some ways. It's hard to say what the US would do, especially given the effects of I think we're probably even more dependent upon enslaved people to survive in the U.S. But I mean, certainly you've got to think that that's going to impact an awful lot of lives if the UK banned slavery in 1817 or 1818 rather than whatever it was, 1846 or something like that, right?
Yeah.
1834, whatever. The Whigs were also they were for women's suffrage, which doesn't occur in the UK until the 20th century, like 1918. So if the UK allows women's suffrage earlier because the Whigs are empowered, because Napoleon won and that hurt the Conservative government, how different is the world if we start having major nations allowing women's suffrage 100 years before that actually happened?
It's incredibly difficult to tell because we don't know how those women would have voted. But certainly, if you give, a whole voting bloc that kind of power, it alters its. And I think this is more important than how they vote is what kind of issues that makes politicians deal with, because suddenly you have to stuff that you weren't paying any attention to because you didn't have to care about the women vote.
And if England did what other countries might, how early might other countries do it? What is that? And so that could impact into the world wars in the 20th century, and certainly lots of things that could be different. This is also darn close to the the Taiping Rebellion, which was the civil war in China that was worse than the First World War.
Yeah.
And so, and given what we're talking about there, it's because if this could have certainly rolled into impacting the U.S. Civil War, then you would think that it could have impacted the Taiping Rebellion 10 years earlier, or the Opium Wars, or also things that caused lots of death and social change in China. Would it have maintained Chinese emperors longer? Might have brought down Chinese emperors sooner. But they were, like today, more closed, and so it's harder for us growing up in America. It's harder for us to, understand exactly how this might have impacted Chinese history because it was a lot more opaque what was going on even with Chinese politics at the time. But China being radically changed, obviously, could impact world history for decades to come.
Yeah. Now I'm going to be a bit of a contrarian here. I do not believe that even if Waterloo results in the British breaking, that was enough for Napoleon to come back to power.
You think so? Because do they come up with another coalition, or do they, especially if the Whigs take power, do they negotiate peace with Napoleon?
Yeah. Now the recent film Napoleon by Ridley Scott, there are some controversial scenes, and we'll just leave it at that. However, mentioning a throwaway movie line, which I thought was absolutely brilliant, was de Talleyrand at one point is discussing that, well, you have to understand, Napoleon is regarded as nothing but a common street thug. And if you look at the powers that are arrayed against him, they are all hereditary monarchies. Mm-hmm. And I do not believe that even if Napoleon pulls out a win, somehow causes the British to withdraw, and maybe fights the Prussians to a standstill, I just don't see that you do not have a repeat of 1813 and 1814, where the traditional powers of Europe.
Especially with that revolution on the doorstep, they're going to export revolution. If Britain leaves the war, Britain was financing the war. If Britain decides to negotiate a peace, then there's no new coalition.
But does England stay out for forever, or do we have another in 2 more years more?
Especially if you start seeing revolution, because there was effort to export revolution to England. There really was,
yeah.
But here's this, because when they restored the monarchy in France. He's awful. He's an idiot.
Pretty much.
So maybe if Napoleon wins, it actually delays, because Napoleon wins, these powers array against him because it's really too much of a change. But they don't get back whichever Louis, I forget what his number was, but when they don't get back this idiot king who spends all their money and puts them into bankruptcy in a couple of years, and so maybe actually it delays revolution in France. It actually France remains a monarchy longer because we don't get this sudden shock of bringing a bad king to power.
I still think the British would have arrayed against France, and that's largely because of economic reasons. And especially after they had been able to minimize the French presence in the areas in which they, Britain, wanted to expand. And let's face it, the other European powers at that point were breathing a sigh of relief that competition for colonies against France would definitely not be as difficult. So I think that you have a lot of economic as well as political factors.
Side there and say a massive British defeat at Waterloo could certainly have led a British public that was just exhausted by war, and the British finance system was exhausted by war, to negotiate peace and say we're going to stop fighting with Napoleon. That's what's the argument. And so there is a piece in the episode where and it was someone else's opinion, but it was like, what had happened if Napoleon had stayed in power longer.
Yeah.
And it's interesting because he was in many ways very much a reformer.
Yeah.
It might have meant great changes.
Yeah, there's a reason that in political science there is a reign of enlightened despots, and Napoleon is certainly an enlightened despot.
Yeah.
So though he controls with an iron hand, the Code Napoleon puts a lot of regulation on trade in all throughout Europe in ways that it had not been done before. So certainly it is a huge impact. Now,
we have no idea what kind of ruler Napoleon's son would have been, because in the Austrian army he died fairly young. Well, he was like 18, I think he died. But I mean, maybe if Napoleon stays in France, he doesn't die. And who knows, what Napoleon II might have been, and if he had reigned, how different would France be, would Europe be, because Napoleon won at Waterloo. From a position of strength, could Napoleon have negotiated at least, because he tried to pass the crown to his son? And then that would have made different interconnections, including, of course, the connection with Austria, because that's where he was married into a Württemberg. Then that could have, changing that whole power structure would be completely different. And do we get, if we get a Napoleon II, do we get a Napoleon III, who also very much impacted history? And I mean, because the Napoleonists stayed at least important in French politics for a very long time after. But if Napoleon wins at Waterloo, does it end up with his son being an emperor, and would that have kept his nephew from becoming an emperor, his great nephew Napoleon III? So I mean, changing who rules France certainly could change through 19th century and into 20th century history in significant ways.
I mean, that easily could impact, French and Austrian connection there could significantly alter, the First World War.
Oh yeah, if that remains, yeah.
Yeah, if that kind of thing hangs on till the the 1910s, that could change some really significant stuff.
Yeah. Now coming back to Tambora and counterfactual history, so a discussion I think needs to happen on the impact, even without Napoleon, of what goes on in Europe. And if Tambora does not erupt, and if you do not have the widespread famine, do you get the massive immigration from Germany to either the United States or at least to other areas, including Russia? Yeah. Apparently the Tsar threw out an invite to any Germans who were interested to come and colonize portions of Russia that were underpopulated. So suddenly we get a pretty significant German population that's headed over towards Eastern Europe. Also, the entire Congress of Vienna. It was interesting that Napoleon gets defeated, and finally Europe breathes a sigh of relief, and then the famine starts. What if the famine doesn't start? What if there really is a period of peace and calm and rebuilding in 1816, 1817, 1818? And how does that affect the overall map of Europe?
Yeah, it doesn't take much to change the power structure in Europe before you see a completely different scenario in the 20th century. That's true.
Yeah, well, because so much of that, I mean, gosh, you talk about German migration and stuff like that. Of course, that had a rather significant effect on say, World War II. And that's, if you change that 100 years before, even if all you're doing is delaying it, which we're not necessarily saying, but certainly the idea of a greater Germany and what encompasses a greater Germany changes if historical migrations are different. Movements toward the United States or toward, because gosh, there was famines in Ireland and there was famines. There was just all over the place.
Mass migration in the United States too. Yeah. So I mean, the westward expansion of the United States could very much have been slowed.
Yeah.
And maybe that comes to some sort of different way that we react to the Native American nations. And maybe those are, more relatively independent. It could have significantly delayed that westward expansion. Of course, without the deaths, though, maybe it would have, made westward expansion more because we'd have more population pressure.
Yeah.
And how many people are alive today, who because we didn't starve? I mean, it's huge. Could be massive. Or maybe we would have just had another food crisis that came because we didn't kill all those people, and we eventually couldn't keep up. Maybe Malthus is right. Maybe the year without the summer delayed the Malthusian prophecy that we would all end up starving because we were growing too fast.
Another good question is, it seemed as if southern Germany was really affected by the famine. And that may just be a reflection of the fact that that's where we get the good documentation from. But if the southern Germany is really getting hit by the famine hard in 1816, 1817, is that one of the reasons that Prussia, which may have been affected a little bit less, comes to dominate what will eventually become United Germany? So what if the Confederation of the Rhine, what if the southern province of Germany are relatively more powerful vis-a-vis Prussia?
I mean, again, it's something that's so important. I mean, much of the kind of German, especially the German military tradition, into the modern era had to do with Prussia.
Austria certainly might have been relatively stronger. Yeah.
Yeah, that's an interesting.
It is, and this is really only a decade and a half before the revolutions of the 1830s, the nationalist movements. So it's hard to say something this close that was this significant might not have impacted those, which drew the map of modern Europe.
Well, yeah, we're talking in the 19th century. That's Germany, that's Italy, nationalities that we consider pretty immobile now. We think of those things as something that doesn't change, that were at the time not at all considered seriously.
People didn't identify as Italians or Germans. So, that whole national movement that occurred just not too long after the Year Without a Summer. Yeah. And I didn't really research, but it had to have affected, say, European involvement in Mexico. I mean, I don't know how South America was impacted really by the Year Without a Summer. Sure, they were, but I didn't do research there. But I mean, it could have meant Mexican independence earlier, or maybe prevented that conflict in Mexico between the conservatives and the liberals that crippled Mexico for 100 years, the period of the Mexican revolutions.
A little closer to Europe, it is interesting that I believe it was in 1818 French soldiers marched back into Spain due to a Republican revolution. And back to the question, 1816 and 1817 are not such rough years. Does Spain get its act together to the point where it becomes it becomes a more major player, at least, if not a major player again?
In the future. Or if Napoleon stays in power, there's a good chance he remains emperor of Spain and Portugal. What if that all stays together as a political entity? What if there is no France and Spain and Portugal? What if it's all one France? So it could go both ways. You're right. So maybe we get empowered Spain, which could have been very different, especially since Spain ended up not playing much role in the two world wars.
Yeah.
Or what if just the opposite? What if there's this massive European nation that remains under single, is radically changing the map of Europe?
Yeah.
I think we're doing great. We're touching a lot of things here, but I would imagine that you could carry it down to the county level. Throughout Europe and say, because of the Year Without a Summer, we either had immigration into, we had immigration out of, we had this many people die, or these fields changed hands, power structures changed because the person that used to be rich is no longer rich because their fields didn't grow. Yeah. I would suspect that you can find down to that level to see how significant this was. So it is possible to say that the eruption of Tambora was one of the most significant events in human history, and that the entire path of entire continents might have been radically different without this one event so dramatically impacting food supplies and migration, and even art and literature and military conquest and leaders.
We're really talking about, essentially the foundation of the modern world in so many ways. Of the political, the artistic, so many of that, and so much of that. If it just went a little differently, if we start talking about having different ideologies. Much of the 20th century was a battle between two ideologies that we're talking about could have maybe shifted significantly, and
different coalitions could have meant completely different things happening in Europe. It could have, and so I think that's true in China as well. It could change our entire vision of what a nation state is. It could have changed our entire vision of how you manage economies. It could have changed which nations were powerful and which were not.
Yeah. And so much, ultimately, in the kind of the web of different things that could have gone on, the further away we get, of course, the more possibilities it seems like there could be. Because, if not for, if we're talking Mount Tambora even, does erupt, but it does so 50 years later, which in, the geological time span is nothing. I don't know what kind of things that might
volcano doesn't
change.
care much if it waits another 50 years.
No.
How different are the impacts there? Because certainly the Waterloo impact, or the impact about Dracula and Frankenstein and things like that. Those were very much tied to the time. So how different would the impact have been? Who might have been in charge then? Who might have starved then? Would the U.S. have fallen into the Civil War at the same time if we'd had a massive famine and migration that was caused just 10 years before the war?
It's really interesting to look at, and I think it's partially gives us a good look at just how stuff outside of completely outside of our control can just absolutely drive human history.
Well, it's probably the reason we're doing this podcast is to talk about counterfactuals.
Yeah.
Someone made a comment on the channel the other day that says you can't change history because history is history, and it's true. I mean, technically that's true. But I mean, if you look at it, there certainly were points where history changed dramatically, where things could have gone different, and that's worth mentioning. And things certainly could have gone different were it not for the eruption of Tambora.
Absolutely.
It profoundly could have impacted Western civilization, Eastern civilization, and the events that are still impacting the world today. No bikes, no Frankenstein, no Dracula.
Yep. That's a short list. Very short list.
I think we came up with a longer one as we were talking.
Yeah, we did.
Everything from no Twilight to Europe has one country that's France, Spain, and Portugal.
Yeah. And I would even propose that the entire the genre of the Gothic horror, the reason that it probably caught on the way that it did, because assuming that the ghost story competition in a non-Tambora world had occurred, and we have the two authors who create this genre, but it gets introduced to a public who are largely happy,
who are not interested in it.
Things are going. Oats are cheap, so they've got more horses than they've ever had before.
You're right. So even if they wrote it, does it catch on? Does it become a genre?
It's fair because because you're right. It's not just that maybe gave them the right atmosphere to write those books, but it definitely gave people the right atmosphere to read them.
The atmosphere to read them. That is absolutely true. Yeah. Well, and, if she doesn't write Frankenstein, there's a good chance we really never hear Mary Shelley's name.
True.
Yeah. Definitely not. And that's really, it is a comment of the times. At the same time, because that occurred, now we have an entire genre of literature, and it is certainly the first Frankenstein, or it's the first science fiction story. I would go so far as to say it really is.
Yeah, I mean, you might find some earlier literature, but I mean, that really creates science fiction as a drama, yeah. So, no Year Without a Summer, no Frankenstein, no Star Trek.
Gosh.
Oh, I'm sorry, Josh is no Star Wars.
I would be sad missing either one of them. That's the...
Yeah, it's a conversation that I had at one point with someone who did study art and was also into pop culture. One of his comments is that, if you look at pop culture and you look at the themes, you can quite often see that the themes of the pop culture are related to what is going on contemporaneously.
Oh, yeah.
So, the recent zombie. The recent popularity of zombies, say, is there an element where people feel as if they're less in control?
Absolutely, or that there's,
and especially post.
I mean, it's not just I mean, there's certain fears of the modern world that would seem to drive that. Yes.
Yeah.
What changed though that let vampires become sparkly?
I'm thinking they may have found something really good in the way of synthetic drugs that somehow came onto the scene at just the right moment. Perhaps it was all those raves they went to, an overdose of ecstasy. I don't know.
She actually dreamed. That was in an episode the other day. She actually dreamed of the sparkly vampire. Would she have had the same dream though if we had never gotten the vampire, the VAMPYRE, the first vampire?
Right. It might go all the way. It might go back to Mormonism, and that given how much she's a Mormon and it impacted a lot of her writing. If Joseph Smith doesn't go down into New York,
if his crops don't fail, he never becomes part of the. That's right. And then the Great Awakening, and then we never get Mormons, and
then maybe we never get Twilight. Maybe that's
no, we never get Twilight. We don't get Southern Utah or Twilight.
Or the Donner Expedition, because no conversation that involves Utah cannot involve the Donner Expedition.
I was just saying, it was the Mormon the Mormon Battalion, which is the only religious battalion in American history. Their role wasn't that big in the Mexican. I don't know if you didn't have the Mormon Battalion, if it would have changed the results of the Mexican War. But they discovered the campsite of the Donner Party, and they actually dealt with many of the remains that were there. So if you didn't have Mormons, you don't have the Donner Party or the Mormon Battalion. So it's
Yeah, so I'm curious about what does a resurgent Spain look like after it declares itself a republic in 1818 or 1819
Oh,
or
that's true. If it comes
1820.
out from
And how
under
does this
Napoleon's thumb,
upset?
yeah, how does it upset the balance of power in Europe? Yeah.
Yeah, does Spain regain more of, does Spain increase its influence in Mexico?
And so then does
And-
Mexico remain under European control longer?
Without having a Maximilian from the... Gosh, what
Well,
was
I mean,
the-
that's later. I mean, the Maximilian comes with
Yeah.
Napoleon III, which of course it could have
Yeah.
all impacted that. But I mean, what if Spain continues its influence and they never get freedom from Spain? And
And then,
is that a more stable Mexico or a less
Yeah,
stable
and that-
Mexico?
yeah, or resurgent Spain decides that this whole Monroe Doctrine from that two-bit American
Which
president,
was around the exact same time.
Yeah.
oddly enough, what if the European powers see that, Spain is able to successfully challenge the Monroe Doctrine, reestablish some of its colonial assets, and suddenly the Germans, who are feeling their oats, decide that it's
'Cause they
time
have them.
to start establishing. Yes, yes, they start. Yep, they start. Yes, suddenly they go to Texas and they brew Shiner Bock.
So we get a German
earlier
Texas.
than-
Is that
See,
what
that's an interesting one. If Germany comes into Texas, and have like a colonial war between Germany and if we're either
in Spain?
yeah, that's
Well, I mean, different,
Yeah.
especially with the lost population, and all that sort of thing too. Is there more European? I mean, are the British more because they were trying to take parts of the Northwest? Could this impact the war with Mexico? Certainly, if the Spanish stayed longer in Mexico, it might have prevented
Yeah.
the war with Mexico. Without the war with Mexico, then we
Gosh.
no independent Texas, and we maybe don't end up getting purchase California, all that. The United States is a completely different map, and maybe the whole Western United States is Spanish, Germans, British, and Russians.
It certainly would have been possible too, even for that Spain had such tenuous control over such a large chunk of that Texas breaks away, and ultimately none of the rest of that tries to break away into their own states. Really, California kind of, but I mean, you could see a place where if the United States isn't getting involved because of or is unable to get involved in the way we did, that we have other countries, and so instead of the United States being
Well, then how different? Not just because we lose all that territory, but without the gold, the California gold, the United States is not the player in the 20th century that it was.
true,
I mean, we might need to play this scenario out in Civ 6.
to see what's because if some other country is in California essentially during the gold rush, and so that they're the country that gets all the benefit
That
from
gets the gold, yeah.
or does that just make the United States invade them? Because as soon as we see that gold, we're like, all right, we can't let that can't stand.
Manifest Destiny becomes even more than a cultural movement. It also becomes a militaristic movement, and the United States takes a far more militaristic outlook vis-a-vis Europe once we've successfully reconquered what is ours, in air quotes.
What if we have a great European war in the Western United States in the middle 19th century?
See, that's an interesting, because there were if you have you don't have
I'm
all
still
the
not quite sure how the
problems.
Germans got to Texas, but I'm willing to buy
They,
that. Okay.
personally, I can see it. Germany wants to get involved. Spain is still being involved. And then Germany thinks, Texas, which is already, trying to fight for its independence, Spain and Mexico, they say, that's a great opportunity for us to move in. Maybe even is invited by Texans who are thinking
Texas.
that, they're thinking just like they were trying to invite the United States, they turned to a different colonial power. And Germany would be a decent option because maybe they're looking around for a place, and that would be an interesting.
Well, the reason for that connection, by the way, is near San Antonio, there was a little town called Frederick. Well, obviously, that is the name of the German emperor of the time. So there is actually substantial German background. There was an immigration from Germany, and a good bit of them did end up in Texas.
I wonder what the Comanches think of that.
The next question is, okay, so the European powers get mired in this constant struggle to who will get the California gold, and they ignore China.
Which they might. Which I mean, gosh, that changes. If China's not
quite the war
forced,
game, yeah.
It was essentially pulled back and forth between various European powers that are essentially ignoring Chinese sovereignty. But
Then China invades California. too, right? So
Yeah, right. They have.
They're not torn apart by European powers. They didn't have all the impacts from the cholera. Yeah, so that, the resurgent China becomes the world power, and
Yeah, I would say that I think that a far less fanciful role for China would be what if China continues in a relatively insular way. The British meddling that ends up in the Opium War and essentially spells the demise of China. What if China holds on for another 20 or 30 years, begins to look westward, much as Japan did, and come to the conclusion that, well, perhaps these modern warships and perhaps some of this modern steam technology would be something we should invest in. Then China potentially does not fall apart, and China takes on the role of a resurgent superpower in the mid or late 1800s. So there's a possible fallout from your the hypothetical Great European War for the Western.
Wars, there's a good chance that you avoid the Taiping Rebellion and the splits that essentially erode China's power during much of the 19th century. So and if China's resurgent, what does that mean in the East? Or what does it mean? Would they have moved west? Or would they have showed up in California? I don't know. We had a good map going there. Now, the Americans then have to ally with the Native American nations to try to defend
the frontier, which is suddenly, which maybe gives some of them a greater autonomy.
I mean, certainly much of the American conquest and genocide of the Native American tribes comes, after the impacts of the Year Without a Summer. So if it affects the war with Mexico or the Civil War, it certainly could have impacted, if we go sooner or later or whatever, in a way that could have impacted, what happens in the American West. I know you guys are in Wyoming and South Dakota, so I mean, maybe those are not American states.
Potentially some huge changes, and I don't know how all that changes, but certainly you alter. I mean, if you don't have Japan, defeating the Russians with the modern fleet in the Russo-Japanese War, I mean that alters the face of Asia for the 20th century.
It does.
Mm. And what if Japanese occupation efforts in Korea are stymied by a resurgent and more powerful China?
But if you think about what that affects in terms of Korea, I mean, Korea is still just an absolutely relevant geopolitical force these days. Of course, it's two Koreas, and you wonder if China or Japan, ends up acting differently. Do we only have one Korea? Does that? I don't know which, but the ideologies might be very different than kind of how we expect them to be. So it is certainly easy, I think, to envision a way that the world changes dramatically, be without Tambora erupting in 1815. And
so the entire world was impacted in massive ways.
Yeah.
And that's how we were. Some of our stuff's been a little off the wall, but I mean, the thing is, it's different. I mean, how do you do a counterfactual when you don't know who exactly was these million people that died of cholera? But it is to say that this event so massively impacted human history and really shows how little humans are versus nature.
Well, we're a very opportunistic species, and if you provide us with different opportunities, you wonder how different that ends up making things look.
And there's a good point. We survived Tambora, so that says a lot about humans. But what if we didn't have to? Then might the whole world be different? Might all the world history from 1815 on be completely different?
Yeah, and I think that you come to a resounding yes. That it would have been very, very significantly different just because of the sheer scale of a large volcanic eruption
affecting the entire world climate for
very remote section of Indonesia.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the History Guy podcast. We hope you enjoyed this episode of Counterfactual History, and if you did, you can find lots more history if you follow the History Guy on YouTube. You can also find us at thehistoryguy.com, Facebook, Patreon, and Locals. If you want to hear more counterfactuals, stay tuned. We release podcasts every 2 weeks.